Hi, today we're covering the homeworld of one of the most frustratingly, stubbornly blockheaded Primarchs in all of Warhammer. Today we're talking about Olympia, the homeworld of Perturabo and his Iron Warriors. And simply by knowing it's the world where Perturabo came to be, you know that this isn't going to be a happy-go-lucky story, as a large part of the world was nothing but mountains, incredibly deep valleys, and rather jagged terrain, hard to cross and hard to establish long existing borders. Because of this terrain, the people of Olympia didn't live in a world where a handful of giant governments controlled mass stretches of land, but rather they lived in hyper-militarized, relatively small city-states. Because of the terrain itself being so jagged and rugged, cultures in Olympia had to become fortified, not just in construction but of mind as well. And this would actually integrate itself into Perturabo. Olympia wasn't just a random rock. It was, in fact, an old colony from the dark age of technology, before the fall of civilization. But, unfortunately, by the time that Perturabo and the Imperium get there, all this great technology and advancements, which had actually been on the planet for a long time, is long gone, and only the echoes of its existence remain. Due to this and the planet's own structure, Olympia became a world where you were either forced to become or be in league with a paranoid genius to survive or fall in line. Olympia's actual physical structure wasn't due to any naturally occurring phenomena. Rather, the planet had been heavily strip mined for its incredibly powerful conductive metals, along with vast stores of fuels eons ago, leaving the people stuck in a rather stagnant pre-atomic, post-atomic industrial era. As while the remains of these great works existed, the technology to recreate did not. It was a world that had all the industry of the 19th century: steam engines, clanking gears, soot-stained faces, the embodiment of a strange mix between diesel punk and steampunk, but with the societal structure and the construction practices of a mix between medieval Europe and the ancient Greeks. Everything was gritty, everything was functionally gray, and it was very, very cold. A brutalist's very dream. But the worst part was indeed the terrain, as Olympia was constant, endless mountain ranges, unnatural valleys, and cliffs that could swallow up entire civilizations, making it so you couldn't build out big, sprawling cities or massive farms that would sustain populations, causing Olympians to have to fight for every single inch of flat ground, leading to the planet being split into several hundred tiny independent city-states that all hated each other, as they spent centuries upon centuries in shifting webs of warfare, fighting over the few green valleys and plateaus that actually existed. The planet itself caused the culture to be built on security, wealth, and dominance. If you lived on Olympia, you wouldn't value poetry, philosophy. You valued rock and stone, since they had metric tons of high-quality rock, but scant few highly refinable metal sources. They became some of the greatest architects of stonework and fortress building the galaxy has ever seen, as long as you don't ask Rogel Dorn or the Imperial Fists. Their keeps and castles were regarded as murderous things, impregnable, cunning, and terrifying all in one, while maintaining the visual flair consistent throughout. Power on Olympia wasn't about who had the most land. It was about who had a castle, a fortress that could never be broken. The 12 strongest rulers were known as the Tyrants of Olympia, and their wars weren't the honorable duels of Raboot Guilliman and the Ultramarines. They weren't what you would want to read in stories. They were messy, ugly games of political assassination, backstabbing, mercenary armies switching sides at a moment's notice, clanking steam-powered mortars, huge tanks which were technologically advanced, but simultaneously powered by an archaic fuel source. This was a world Perturabo was dropped into, and it was a world where loyalty was bought through gold and siegecraft, and peacetime was spent building thicker and thicker walls. His first 2 years were spent within the mountains of the world, but eventually, tales of a prodigious child would spread throughout the world, and eventually he would be found climbing the mountains outside of the hold of a man named Dammekos, the Tyrant of Lochos, and it would be he who most shaped Perturabo, regardless of if the Primarch was willing to admit it. Because when you grew up as a child of a man who saw value measured in how well you could build a wall or tear one down, it is no wonder that Perturabo ended up being the most bitter, siege-obsessed Primarch of the bunch. He didn't learn how to fight a noble war. He learned that the world was a cruel, jagged, harsh place that you have to blast and beat into submission. And now it's time to get into the real meat and potatoes of this story. We've talked about the world proper. We've talked about the man shaped by the world, or rather the demigod, who was dropped into the middle of it. But if you thought that was a masterclass in unfortunate circumstances, the story of Perturabo's early years goes a little bit further, as he didn't land in a city. Instead, his Primarch pod landed in a rocky, freezing section of the wilds just outside of Lochos. And for years, the guards of the Tyrant Dammekos had been hearing some weird urban legends about this wonder boy or this wild man wandering the outskirts. Supposedly, this kid was bouncing from village to village, working as a mercenary and a master craftsman for hire. Keep in mind that at this point, Perturabo literally looks like an oversized child. But he was already outfighting men and outbuilding entire work crews single-handedly, making master masons seem moronic. Dammekos, being the classic opportunistic ruler that he was, hears this and basically thinks, in the old Greco-Roman tradition type of way, I need to get this kid in my family pronto. And eventually they do find him, climbing the very cliffs into the city near Dammekos' hold, leaving the tyrant to put him through a series of tests. He has him fight the best warriors of the planet. Perturabo crushes them. He has the smartest scholars create puzzles and riddles for Perturabo. He solves them easily. He proposes the greatest of military challenges just to see what the young child would do. And once again, Perturabo easily resolves a problem that his entire military command could not conceive had even the faintest glimmer of a solution. So eventually, they would strike a deal. Perturabo, also being quite smart, recognizes that this is a great boon. He gets protection, information, and the ability to create, alongside with authority. And Dammekos gets a veritable living weapon, a master of all things war. But as time passed, Olympians would attempt to give him some amount of affection. Unfortunately, they would never give it back, to the point that they saw Perturabo as part of his nature, being cold and untrusting, a veritable reflection of the world. And you might think, well, that's just Perturabo being a jerk. He's always been a jerk. But there is a reason for this. The moment Perturabo climbed those cliffs as a kid, he looked up and saw something in the sky, something no one else could see. He saw a swirling, nebulous vortex, an unending nightmare. He saw a star maelstrom, one that felt like it was judging him, eyeing his every move, spying on his very soul. He saw the Eye of Terror. And in no short terms, he basically would ask those in power and with knowledge, hey, do you see that giant screaming vortex in reality? And they would just look at him as if he were crazy. During his entire life on Olympia, he lived with that thing staring at him, being unable to truly recognize what it was. This was the Eye of Terror, and he was intrinsically linked to it due to his status as a Primarch. However, there was one small bright side. His sister. He did in fact love his adopted sister, to the point that she was the only one allowed to use a nickname for him. Eventually, the boy grows up, takes his name, makes a beast out of himself to get rid of the pain of being a man, so he goes as far as to not taking the family name from Dammekos. He digs through ancient texts, which are forbidden and restricted to all, even the royal family, and he finds the name Perturabo. Deciding he likes it, he takes it for himself, becoming the Hammer of Olympia. And he is not just a general, he is an inventor, and he starts pumping out blueprints for things the planet had never seen, revolutionary medicine, astronomical tools, and most importantly for the world, terrifying new siege engines. However, despite this, Perturabo wants to build architecture, public works, things of beauty. Unfortunately, the situation across the world prevents him from being able to do that, as the world being shaped in constant conflict makes his father have to lean slightly more heavily towards some aspect of what Perturabo can do than others. And under Perturabo's command, Lochos becomes the undisputed superpower of the planet. But Perturabo didn't care about the fame that came with it. He didn't care about the titles or the nobility. He absolutely hated the court. He hated the poisoner's kiss and all the backstabbing. He, much like the mountains of the world, became this giant, brooding figure with a veritable steel executioner's mask bound to his face. And much like the planet that had shaped him, he would kill you for even the most minor of insults. He became what he was surrounded by, and he was surrounded by people who either wanted to kill him or use him to kill others. And he knew it. The crazy thing was, Perturabo was actually a man of his word for most of his life. As long as you schmoozed him the right way, he would work with you. Begrudgingly, but he would. He could have overthrown Dammekos any day in a handful of minutes. He was stronger. He was smarter. The army loved him, not due to who he was, but the fact that he guaranteed them victory. But he had made a bargain, and he refused to break it. And in essence, at this point, he was just waiting for the old man to die so he could finally take over. And maybe, restructure the world and build something beautiful instead of just weapons. But he would never get that chance, because just as he was reaching his peak, and just as he was about to subdue the whole world, gaining the freedom and the time he needed, a new star appeared upon the sky. And it kept getting closer and closer still, but it wasn't a star. Through it came a gold-plated ship. The Emperor had arrived. With the Emperor finally arriving on Olympia, the whole Emperor shebang, what usually happens when he finds one of his sons, happened. Leman Russ challenged him to a drinking contest, Vulcan to a smithing duel, and a monster hunting game. Angron, well, things could have just gone better. But Perturabo, he just said okay. There was no fighting, there was no dramatic rebellion. Records just show that there was a transaction, a quick, quiet, and simple one. See, Perturabo was a genius, and he already looked at his own biology and understood that he was a more than 10-foot tall giant that could outthink even the greatest of supercomputers. He basically figured out, yeah, I'm clearly an artificially created being, and I was made by someone far more powerful than anything on this planet, for a reason greater than anything this planet could provide me. Eventually, that guy's just going to show up, and I'm not going to be able to do anything about it. So when the gold-clad giant descends from the clouds, Perturabo wasn't surprised. He was nonplussed that he had to wait so long. And what about Dammekos, the tyrant who raised him? You'd think he'd be upset about losing his greatest general, his adopted son, but Dammekos was a weird combination of a politician and a father at the end. He saw the Emperor, and he realized that being a governor in a galactic empire was a much better gig than being the tyrant of one rocky planet. He basically allowed Perturabo to be a borrowed tool, trading a son for a promotion. However, he did believe that this was in fact actually the best for Perturabo. But to Perturabo, he basically realized that his father saw him as a resource to be traded away the moment a better offer came along. So Perturabo was then whisked to Terra, leaving the world, finally able to see the cradle of humanity and spend time with his father properly. And you'd think meeting his brothers, being told of his great noble purpose, his new place in the galaxy, being given a literal legion of super soldiers to go gloriously conquer the universe, you'd think that all this would make him feel at home. But instead, he believes he got dropped into a group of the most ego-driven, powerful beings in existence, and Perturabo, being the broody, socially awkward architect, didn't exactly click with any of the others. In fact, he grew scornful constantly of his brother Dorn. Then the Emperor hands him the keys to his legion officially, and Perturabo looks at the soldiers, his sons, made from his own gene seed, his DNA, the closest things to heirs he could ever have. And after renaming them into the Iron Warriors, he decimates them. And as they set out about into the Great Crusade, the planet he grew up on is still affecting him, as much like then, he didn't want the glory like that which was given to Sanguinius, the adulation that was given to Horus, or the speed of the White Scars. He wants to do a job and do it as well as possible, but this is a double-edged sword, because just as in Olympia, he really was the best at what he does, causing him to constantly get the most challenging job. And since he could never back down or admit that someone was better than him, he would keep getting the unpleasant jobs, completing them, never complaining, only to get another unpleasant job. A vicious cycle that continued to the point that people start thinking that Perturabo actually liked being miserable and suffering, leading to no small amount of resentment to start building up. He finally found this greater purpose that he had been expecting since he first gained consciousness in Olympia. But that purpose just ended up being more of the same hammering he did in Olympia, just on a much grander scale. And now he reached a point of no return. The man had never truly left his planet. He just realized the whole galaxy was Olympia, and he was never leaving it, no matter what he did. Now that he was in charge of a legion, he was technically also the Lord of Olympia, meaning that he could officially dispose of his adopted father. But again, being as uncaring as the planet he was found on, he just let him stay as governor. But this disregard actually left his father embittered, poisoning the well, if you will. Perturabo had left a planet that was not just a rocky outcropping, it was a veritable time bomb of rebellion. And everything would come to head during the Sak'trada campaign when the Iron Warriors were fighting the Horus. And if you didn't know it, the Horus are these terrifying, time-warping Xenos abominations that even the Dark Angels, with their most advanced technology, had an incredibly hard time dealing with. These beings create aging fields that in a few seconds speed existence up by decades. It was a nightmare campaign that left the Legion battered, old, and mentally broken. And right in the middle of this great struggle, Perturabo gets news. His homeworld, Olympia, had revolted and was attempting to secede from the Imperium, as the planet was tired of its youth being taken and forcefully inducted into the Iron Warriors at a rate that they felt they couldn't maintain. And with Dammekos gone, the old city-states began infighting again. For Perturabo, it was the ultimate insult. He had given everything to the Imperium, and he was just asking his planet to do the same. And his home betrayed him, coldly and cruelly. Perturabo then goes back to Olympia, and he isn't there to talk. He gives them a horrific choice: decimation, or I kill everyone myself. And when they inevitably refused, he didn't blink. They weren't calling a bluff, as he led the Iron Warriors street by street, purging his own people. This massacre was of such an extreme scale that even some of his sons, men who were literally brainwashed for war, stopped and asked Perturabo, "Father, we cannot do this." And Perturabo, being as cold and unfeeling as the mountains, had them killed too. By the time the smoke cleared, more than 5 million people were dead, and giant funeral pyres lit up the Olympian sky in cold silence. And when that silence finally broke, Perturabo realized that he could never go back to who he was, that his father would never forgive him, that he was a monster. Then the heresy would come, Perturabo would be a traitor, Isfan 5, the whole shebang, but this isn't really dealing with Olympia. But Olympia was indeed the start of it. Likely the entire rebellion was set up by Horus. And after the failure of what was the Siege of Terra, the Iron Warriors didn't go back to a functioning world. They retreated after destroying Olympia through their stellar empire, fighting what was described as a methodical, attritional withdrawal, where they would bleed the loyalists for every pound of flesh they could. And eventually they would realize that holding real space territory for them at this point was a losing game. So Perturabo led his sons to the Eye of Terror. There they didn't find a new home. Instead, they built a new nightmare. They claimed a demon world named Mendrigad. It was not a planet in a traditional sense, at least not anymore. It was a fortress world of infinite towers, deep trenches, and great crevasses, where the laws of physics didn't really apply anymore. It was, ironically enough, very similar, if not a twisted version, to the landscapes Perturabo had grown up on. And finally, Perturabo, a man who prided himself in cold logic and stone, became a demon Primarch on a demon world. Despite all this, he would eternally be shaped, influenced, and controlled by the landscapes and the cities of Olympia. No matter what he did, he would never be able to escape his homeworld, never be able to shake its influence. Perturabo was Olympia, and Olympia was Perturabo.